What if I told you that a monster walked free for 32 years, living his life, raising a family, attending barbecues, and sleeping peacefully every single night while the ghost of a 12-year-old girl waited patiently for justice? What if I told you that the very technology that would eventually catch him didn't even exist when he committed his unspeakable crime? And what if I told you that this monster's own DNA, left behind at the scene of a brutal murder in 1986, would become the key that finally unlocked a case that haunted an entire community for over 3 decades? This is the story of Michella Welch, a girl whose smile could light up any room, whose laughter was contagious, and whose life was stolen on a sunny March afternoon in Tacoma, Washington. This is also the story of detectives who refused to give up, of a community that never forgot, and of a killer who thought he had gotten away with murder. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. If you believe that every victim deserves to have their story told, if you believe that justice delayed is not justice denied, hit that subscribe button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story, because what you're about to witness is one of the most remarkable cases of perseverance and justice in American criminal history, and Michella's story deserves to be heard by millions. Let me take you back to March 26, 1986. The world was a different place then. Ronald Reagan was president. The Challenger disaster had just shocked the nation 2 months earlier, and in Tacoma, Washington, spring was slowly pushing through the remnants of winter. The cherry blossoms were beginning to bloom, and there was a crispness in the air that promised warmer days ahead. Michella Welch was just 12 years old, but she carried responsibilities far beyond her years. She was the kind of girl who stepped up when others stepped back, the kind of sister who put her siblings first, the kind of daughter who made her parents proud even in the smallest moments. On that particular Wednesday afternoon, Michella was babysitting her 2 younger sisters at Puget Park, a sprawling green space that served as a community gathering spot in the north end of Tacoma. The park was supposed to be safe. It was supposed to be a place where children could run and play, where families could picnic on warm afternoons, where the biggest worry was whether it might rain. But evil doesn't respect boundaries. Evil doesn't care about innocence. And on that March afternoon, evil was watching. Michella's younger sisters were hungry, and being the responsible big sister she was, Michella decided to ride her bicycle home to make them lunch. It was a short trip, just a few blocks through familiar streets. She had made this ride countless times before. She promised her sisters she would be back soon, hopped on her bike, and pedaled away. She never returned. When Michella didn't come back after what seemed like too long, her younger sisters grew worried. They were too young to understand the magnitude of what was happening, too innocent to imagine the horror that was unfolding just a short distance away. Eventually, they made their way home, expecting to find their big sister in the kitchen, maybe frustrated that she had been delayed, but safe. Instead, they found an empty house and a growing sense of dread that even their young minds could comprehend. The search for Michella began almost immediately. Her parents, frantic with worry, contacted neighbors, friends, anyone who might have seen their daughter. As the hours ticked by, hope began to fade and fear began to take its place. The Tacoma Police Department was called, and what started as a missing persons case quickly transformed into something far more sinister. The following morning, March 27, 1986, a jogger running through a gulch area near Puget Park made a discovery that would shatter any remaining hope. There, in a secluded ravine, was the body of Michella Welch. She had been sexually assaulted and stabbed to death, her young life extinguished with a brutality that defied comprehension. The crime scene told a story of unimaginable violence. Investigators documented everything meticulously, collecting evidence that they hoped would lead them to Michella's killer. They found biological evidence, samples that would be preserved carefully, though in 1986, the technology to fully analyze DNA was still in its infancy. They found signs of a struggle, evidence that young Michella had fought back against her attacker with everything she had. Detective investigators canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed hundreds of potential witnesses, and followed every lead that came their way. The community was in shock. Parents held their children closer. The park that had once been a symbol of childhood joy became a reminder of unthinkable tragedy. In the weeks and months that followed, tips poured in. Some were credible, some were the products of paranoid imaginations, and some led investigators down rabbit holes that ended in frustration. The police developed suspects, conducted interviews, administered polygraph tests, but nothing stuck. The killer remained a ghost, a phantom who had struck with devastating efficiency and then vanished into the fabric of everyday life. What the investigators didn't know then, what no one could have predicted, was that solving Michella's murder would require patience measured not in months or years, but in decades. The monster who killed her would live the next 32 years as a free man, protected by the limitations of the technology of the time and the vastness of a world that had not yet been connected by the digital threads that would eventually ensnare him. But the evidence waited. Sealed in bags, stored in evidence rooms, the biological material left behind by Michella's killer remained intact. And somewhere, in the silent patience of scientific samples, justice was simply waiting for the right moment to announce itself. The investigation into Michella Welch's murder was one of the most intensive in Tacoma history, but it was also one of the most frustrating. Detective after detective poured their hearts into the case, spending countless hours chasing leads that seemed promising but ultimately led nowhere. The weight of this unsolved murder hung over the Tacoma Police Department like a storm cloud that refused to dissipate. In those early months after the murder, the community rallied together in ways both beautiful and heartbreaking. Vigils were held at Puget Park, where candles flickered in the darkness and prayers were whispered for a little girl who would never grow up. Michella's family, devastated beyond words, became advocates for other victims, channeling their grief into purpose. But the question that haunted everyone remained unanswered. Who had done this? Who had stolen Michella from the world? The police developed several persons of interest. They looked at known sex offenders in the area, interviewed individuals who had been seen near the park that day, and even considered whether the killer might have been someone Michella knew. Each theory was pursued with determination, but each eventually hit a wall. One of the most significant challenges facing investigators was the limitation of forensic technology in 1986. DNA profiling was just beginning to emerge as a tool in criminal investigations. The landmark case in the United Kingdom where DNA was first used to solve a murder had occurred just that same year. In the United States, the technology was even further behind. Investigators had collected biological evidence from the crime scene and from Michella's body, but the means to analyze it in a way that could definitively identify a suspect simply did not exist. This biological evidence was carefully preserved, sealed away in the hope that someday, science would catch up with the evil that had visited Puget Park on that March afternoon. It was an act of faith, a bet on the future, and it would prove to be one of the most important decisions in the case. The years began to pass. 1986 became 1987, then 1988, then 1989. The case remained open, but active leads dried up. Detectives who had worked the case retired or moved on to other assignments. New faces joined the department, and while they were briefed on the Welch case, the urgency that had characterized the initial investigation inevitably faded. But Michella was not forgotten. Her family made sure of that. They spoke at community events, participated in crime prevention programs, and kept their daughter's memory alive in 1,000 small ways. Every anniversary of her death was marked with remembrance, a reminder to the community and to the police that this case was not closed, that justice had not been served. By the early 1990s, DNA technology had advanced significantly. Cold cases across the country were being solved as evidence collected years earlier was finally analyzed with new techniques. Investigators submitted the biological evidence from Michella's case for DNA testing. A profile was developed, a genetic fingerprint of the killer, but there was no match in any database. The killer's DNA was now known, but his identity remained a mystery. This was both a breakthrough and a frustration. Investigators now had irrefutable proof of who they were looking for, genetically speaking, but without a name to attach to that profile, they were no closer to an arrest. The DNA was run against the Cody's database repeatedly over the years as that database grew, but each time, the result was the same: no match. The turn of the millennium came and went. Michella would have been 26 years old in the year 2000, perhaps married with children of her own, perhaps pursuing a career that utilized the caring and responsible nature she had shown even as a child. Instead, she remained forever 12, preserved in photographs and memories while the world moved on without her. The investigators who had worked her case originally were now retired or deceased. A new generation had taken their places, and while they inherited the case files and the preserved evidence, they also inherited the frustration of their predecessors. The Welch case became a symbol of the limitations of law enforcement, a reminder that sometimes, despite the best efforts of good people, evil escaped punishment. But something was changing in the world of forensic science, something that would eventually rewrite the rules of criminal investigation and give new hope to cases that had seemed hopelessly cold. Genetic genealogy, the use of DNA to trace family trees and identify individuals through their relatives, was emerging as a revolutionary tool. Companies like Ancestry and 23andMe were building vast databases of genetic information as millions of people submitted samples to learn about their heritage. Law enforcement began to realize that these databases could be used to solve crimes. Even if a suspect had never submitted their own DNA, their relatives might have. By analyzing the genetic markers shared between the crime scene DNA and individuals in public genealogy databases, investigators could potentially identify the suspect's family tree and work backward to identify the killer. The breakthrough came in April 2018 with the arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, who was identified through genetic genealogy after decades of evading capture. The success of that case opened floodgates. Suddenly, cold cases that had seemed unsolvable were being cracked open across the country. In Tacoma, investigators took notice. They looked at the Welch case with fresh eyes, wondering if this new technology might finally provide the answers they had sought for over 3 decades. The DNA profile they had developed years earlier was still viable, still waiting to reveal its secrets. The decision was made to partner with Parabon Nanolabs and submit the evidence for genetic genealogy analysis. It was a long shot, dependent on the killer or his relatives having contributed to public genealogy databases, but it was a shot that investigators were willing to take. The process of genetic genealogy is painstaking and complex. It requires not just scientific expertise, but also genealogical research skills, the ability to trace family trees through generations, to identify connections that span continents and centuries. When investigators submitted the DNA evidence from Michella Welch's case for this new type of analysis, they knew they were embarking on a journey that might take months or even years to complete. The DNA was uploaded to Genealogy, a public genealogy database where people voluntarily share their genetic information to find relatives and trace their ancestry. Unlike the criminal DNA databases that law enforcement had been using for years, Genealogy contained samples from ordinary citizens, people who had never committed crimes but who had submitted their DNA out of curiosity about their family history. The initial results were promising. The analysis identified several genetic matches, individuals who shared significant amounts of DNA with the unknown killer. These weren't close relatives like siblings or parents, but more distant connections, cousins and second cousins whose genetic profiles partially overlapped with the crime scene DNA. Now the real detective work began. Genetic genealogists began constructing family trees, starting with the identified matches and working backward through generations. Birth records, marriage certificates, census data, obituaries, all became pieces of a puzzle that was slowly taking shape. The investigators were looking for a male who would have been in the Tacoma area in 1986, someone who fit the profile they had developed over the years. The genetic genealogy narrowed the field considerably, pointing toward specific family lines that warranted closer examination. Let me pause here and ask you something. Imagine you submitted your DNA to a genealogy website, hoping to learn about your ancestors or find long-lost relatives. Would you ever imagine that your genetic information might help solve a murder that happened decades ago, committed by someone in your extended family? Think about that for a moment. Drop a comment below and tell me how you would feel if you discovered your DNA helped catch a killer. Your thoughts matter, and I read every single comment. As the investigation continued, a name began to emerge from the genetic fog: Gary Charles Hartman. Born in 1961, Hartman would have been 24 years old at the time of Michella's murder. He had lived in Tacoma his entire life, was familiar with the area around Puget Park, and fit the general profile that investigators had developed over the years. But having a name was not enough. Investigators needed to confirm that Hartman's DNA matched the evidence from the crime scene. To do this, they would need to obtain a sample of his DNA without alerting him to the investigation. If Hartman knew he was a suspect, he might flee, destroy evidence, or take other steps to evade capture. The process of obtaining DNA from a suspect without their knowledge is a delicate operation. Investigators followed Hartman, observed his daily routines, and waited for an opportunity to collect a sample. The breakthrough came when Hartman discarded a cup at a local establishment. Investigators retrieved the cup and submitted it for DNA analysis. The results were conclusive. Gary Hartman's DNA was a match to the biological evidence collected from Michella Welch's body 32 years earlier. After decades of dead ends and frustration, investigators finally had their killer. But as they dug deeper into Hartman's background, what they discovered was perhaps even more disturbing than the crime itself. Gary Hartman was not some drifter or obvious threat. He was a nurse, a healthcare professional who had spent his career in positions of trust. He had worked at Tacoma General Hospital and Western State Hospital, caring for vulnerable patients who placed their lives in his hands. Hartman was married with children. He attended community events, maintained relationships with neighbors, and presented himself as a respectable member of society. For 32 years, he had hidden in plain sight, living just miles from where he had committed his horrific crime, watching as the investigation into Michella's death gradually faded from public attention. The revelation that a killer could maintain such a normal facade for so long sent shockwaves through the community. Parents who had brought their children to the very hospitals where Hartman worked felt a chill run down their spines. Neighbors who had shared pleasantries with him over backyard fences struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the monster who had murdered a 12-year-old girl. The arrest, when it came, was carefully planned. Investigators could not risk any error that might jeopardize the case they had worked so hard to build. On June 20, 2018, Gary Hartman was taken into custody, charged with the first-degree murder of Michella Welch. The arrest of Gary Hartman was front-page news across Washington state and beyond. The case became a symbol of both the horror of unsolved crimes and the hope that new technology could bring justice to victims and their families even decades after the fact. When Hartman was brought before a judge for his initial hearing, the courtroom was packed. Michella's family was there, including her mother, who had waited 32 years for this moment. She had never stopped believing that someday, somehow, her daughter's killer would be caught. Now, looking at the man accused of stealing her child's life, she finally had a face to attach to the monster who had haunted her nightmares for over 3 decades. Hartman, for his part, seemed almost ordinary in the courtroom. He was 57 years old now, gray-haired and unremarkable in appearance. There was nothing about him that screamed murderer, nothing that would make you cross the street if you saw him approaching. And perhaps that was the most terrifying thing of all. The legal proceedings moved forward with the weight of history behind them. Prosecutors laid out their case methodically, building a narrative that connected the DNA evidence to the crime scene to the defendant. The genetic genealogy evidence was presented, explaining how investigators had used family trees and genetic markers to identify Hartman as a suspect. The defense, meanwhile, faced an uphill battle. DNA evidence is notoriously difficult to dispute when properly collected and analyzed. While Hartman's attorneys explored various legal strategies, the scientific evidence against their client was overwhelming. As the case progressed, more details about Hartman's life emerged. Colleagues from the hospitals where he had worked were interviewed, many of them expressing shock and disbelief. Some remembered him as quiet and professional, someone who did his job without drawing attention to himself. Others recalled moments that, in hindsight, seemed unsettling, small behaviors that might have been warning signs had anyone known what to look for. The investigation also revealed that Hartman had been questioned in connection with other cases over the years, though nothing had ever been proven. This raised disturbing questions about whether he might have committed other crimes that had gone undetected, other victims who might still be waiting for justice. Michella's family spoke publicly about their daughter for the first time in years. They described a bright, loving girl who had dreamed of becoming a veterinarian because of her love for animals. They talked about her sense of humor, her kindness to her younger siblings, and the way she could make anyone smile. They wanted the world to see Michella as more than a victim, to understand the fullness of the life that had been stolen. The community of Tacoma rallied around the family. Memorials were held at Puget Park, where flowers and candles were left in Michella's memory. Strangers reached out with messages of support, sharing their own memories of the fear that had gripped the city in 1986 and the relief they felt that the killer had finally been caught. But even as the legal process moved forward, questions lingered. How had Hartman escaped detection for so long? What had his life been like during those 32 years of freedom? Had he truly believed he would never be caught, or had he lived each day with the fear that his past would eventually catch up with him? Those who study criminal psychology offered various theories. Some suggested that Hartman was a sociopath, capable of compartmentalizing his crime and continuing with normal life as if nothing had happened. Others proposed that the passage of time had allowed him to convince himself that the murder was safely buried in the past, a youthful aberration that would never resurface. Whatever the psychological explanation, the fact remained that Gary Hartman had lived as a free man for over 3 decades while Michella Welch lay in her grave. He had enjoyed holidays with his family, celebrated birthdays, watched his children grow up, all experiences that were denied to Michella and that her family could only imagine. The prosecutors were determined to ensure that Hartman would face the full consequences of his actions. They prepared their case meticulously, anticipating every possible defense and building a narrative that would leave no reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. As the legal proceedings continued, the weight of evidence against Gary Hartman became increasingly insurmountable. The prosecution's strategy centered on the DNA evidence, which formed an unbreakable chain connecting Hartman to the crime scene and to Michella's body. Expert witnesses were brought in to explain the science behind genetic genealogy, walking through the process that had led investigators from a crime scene sample to Gary Hartman's front door. They presented the statistical probability of a false match, numbers so astronomical that they effectively eliminated any possibility of error. The odds that the DNA belonged to someone other than Hartman were essentially zero. But the prosecution also understood that a case is about more than just science. They wanted everyone to understand who Michella Welch was, to see her as the vibrant 12-year-old girl she had been, not just a name in a case file. They called witnesses who had known Michella, teachers who remembered her enthusiasm, neighbors who recalled her friendly wave, family members who described her dreams and aspirations. The defense, faced with seemingly insurmountable evidence, explored every possible avenue. They questioned the chain of custody of the DNA evidence, asking whether samples collected in 1986 could truly be relied upon after more than 3 decades. They raised concerns about the emerging field of genetic genealogy, suggesting that the science was too new to be fully trusted. But their arguments gained little traction. The DNA evidence had been preserved according to established protocols, and the genetic genealogy techniques, while relatively new to criminal investigations, were based on well-established principles of genetics. The science was solid, and the connection to Hartman was undeniable. Throughout the proceedings, Gary Hartman sat mostly silent, his expression difficult to read. Some observers described him as emotionless, others as defeated. The man who had hidden behind a mask of normalcy for 32 years now sat exposed, his true nature laid bare before the world. Then came the moment that changed everything. Faced with the overwhelming evidence against him, Gary Hartman made a decision that would spare the family the agony of a prolonged trial. In 2019, he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in the death of Michella Welch. The guilty plea was both a relief and a frustration for Michella's family. On one hand, it meant certainty. There would be no chance of acquittal, no possibility that a technicality might set the killer free. On the other hand, it meant that Hartman would never have to take the stand, never have to explain his actions, never have to answer the question that had haunted Michella's family for over 3 decades. Why? The most powerful moments came when Michella's family addressed the court during the sentencing hearing. Her mother, now elderly but still possessing the strength that had carried her through 32 years of grief, spoke directly about the daughter she had lost. She described the morning of March 26, 1986, how ordinary it had seemed, how quickly everything had changed. She talked about the years of waiting, the anniversaries marked with tears instead of celebrations, the grandchildren that Michella would never know. When she finally looked at Gary Hartman, her voice remained steady even as tears streamed down her face. She asked him why, knowing she would likely never receive an answer. She told him that while he had stolen her daughter's life, he had not stolen her memory, and that Michella would be remembered with love long after his name was forgotten. The judge listened carefully to all the statements before pronouncing sentence. Gary Hartman was sentenced to 26 years and 8 months in prison. Given that he was 57 years old at the time of sentencing, this effectively meant he would likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. The reaction was immediate and emotional. Michella's family embraced, tears of relief and grief mingling together. Investigators who had worked the case, some of them now retired but present in the courtroom to see the conclusion of their life's work, nodded solemnly. Justice, delayed for so long, had finally been served. The conviction of Gary Hartman was more than just the resolution of a single case. It represented a turning point in criminal justice, a demonstration of how technology could bring closure to families who had waited decades for answers. In the aftermath of the sentencing, law enforcement agencies across the country took notice. The success of genetic genealogy in solving the Welch case, along with similar breakthroughs in other cold cases, led to increased investment in this new investigative tool. Police departments began reviewing old cases, identifying those where DNA evidence had been preserved and might benefit from genealogical analysis. The Welch case became a teaching example for investigators and prosecutors nationwide. It demonstrated the importance of preserving biological evidence even when current technology cannot fully analyze it. The detectives who had collected and stored that evidence in 1986 could never have imagined the technology that would eventually use it, but their foresight and professionalism made justice possible. For Michella's family, the verdict brought a measure of peace that had eluded them for 32 years. They knew that no court decision could bring their daughter back, that no amount of justice could undo the horror of what had happened. But knowing that her killer would spend the rest of his life in prison, that he would never again walk the streets of Tacoma or any other city, provided some comfort. The family also found solace in the knowledge that Michella's case might help other victims find justice. By sharing their story, by participating in interviews and media coverage, they hoped to inspire other families who were still waiting, still hoping, for answers in their own cases. The investigators who had worked on the case over the decades were celebrated as heroes. From the original detectives who had preserved the DNA evidence in 1986, never knowing when or if it might be useful, to the modern team that had utilized genetic genealogy to finally identify the killer, each had played a crucial role in bringing Gary Hartman to justice. The partnership with Parabon Nanolabs proved instrumental in cracking the case. Their expertise in genetic genealogy, combined with the determination of Tacoma investigators, created a formula for success that would be replicated in cold cases across the nation. The case also sparked broader conversations about privacy, DNA databases, and the ethical implications of genetic genealogy. Some raised concerns about the use of public genealogy databases for criminal investigations, arguing that individuals who submitted their DNA for ancestry research had not consented to having it used by law enforcement. These debates continue today, as society grapples with the balance between solving crimes and protecting privacy. But for most people, the resolution of Michella's case was simply a victory for justice. A little girl who had been failed by the limitations of technology in 1986 had finally been vindicated by the advancements of 2018. A monster who had hidden in plain sight for over 3 decades had been unmasked and held accountable. The case also highlighted the importance of never giving up on cold cases. For 32 years, Michella's case had remained technically open, even as active investigation waned. The decision to apply new technology to old evidence proved that no case is ever truly cold, that justice can come at any time, and that killers should never feel safe. In prison, Gary Hartman faced the reality of spending his remaining years behind bars. The man who had lived as a respected healthcare professional, a family man, a neighbor, was now an inmate, stripped of his freedom and his facade. Reports from the prison system described Hartman as quiet and withdrawn. He kept to himself, avoiding interactions with other inmates and staff when possible. Whether this was a strategy for survival in an environment where crimes against children are particularly reviled, or simply the natural behavior of a man whose true nature had always been hidden, was unclear. For Hartman's family, the revelation of his crimes was devastating. His wife, his children, everyone who had believed they knew him, now had to confront the reality that they had been living with a murderer. The ripple effects of Hartman's crime extended far beyond his direct victim, touching everyone who had been connected to him. Some family members distanced themselves entirely, unable to reconcile their memories with the monster they now knew him to be. Others sought therapy to process the trauma of learning that someone they loved had committed such horrific acts. The collateral damage of Hartman's crime continued to spread decades after the original act. Meanwhile, investigators continued to examine whether Hartman might be responsible for other unsolved crimes. His position at psychiatric hospitals had given him access to vulnerable individuals, and his ability to evade detection for so long suggested a level of cunning that raised concerns about other potential victims. While no additional charges were filed, the investigation into Hartman's past remained ongoing. The families of other missing and murdered individuals watched and waited, hoping that their own answers might emerge from the shadow of Hartman's conviction. In Tacoma, the community began the long process of healing. Puget Park, the site of so much tragedy, was gradually reclaimed by families who refused to let one man's evil define their neighborhood. New generations of children played on the same fields where Michella had once watched over her sisters, their laughter a testament to the resilience of a community that had refused to be permanently scarred. Memorials to Michella were established throughout the city. Her story was shared in schools and community centers, a reminder of the importance of safety and vigilance, but also of hope and perseverance. Annual remembrance events were held, bringing together those who had known Michella, those who had worked her case, and those who simply wanted to honor her memory. The story of Michella Welch became more than just a murder case. It became a story about perseverance, about never giving up, about believing that justice, however delayed, would eventually prevail. Law enforcement officers across the country used the case as an example of why cold cases should never be abandoned, why evidence should always be preserved, and why hope should never be extinguished. For the detectives who had finally solved the case, there was a sense of profound satisfaction mixed with lingering sadness. They had achieved what had seemed impossible, bringing a killer to justice after more than 3 decades. But they also knew that no arrest could undo the damage that had been done, could not restore the life that had been stolen, could not erase the years of pain that Michella's family had endured. The story of Michella Welch ends not with tragedy, but with triumph. Not with despair, but with the undeniable power of justice finally served. 32 years after a monster stole a little girl's life, that monster sits in a cell, stripped of his freedom, his reputation, and his mask. Every day he wakes, he is reminded of the crime that defined his existence. Every night he sleeps on a prison bed, knowing that he will never again walk freely under the open sky. Michella Welch never got to grow up. She never graduated from high school, never went to college, never became the veterinarian she had dreamed of becoming. She never fell in love, never got married, never held her own children in her arms. Gary Hartman stole all of that from her on a March afternoon in 1986. But Hartman could not steal her legacy. He could not erase the love that her family carries for her every single day. He could not silence the determination of the investigators who refused to let her case go cold. He could not prevent the advancement of technology that would ultimately expose his identity and bring him to justice. In the end, Michella won. Not because her life was restored, but because her death was not forgotten. Not because her killer was punished, but because her story inspired others to never give up, to keep fighting, to believe that even the coldest cases can eventually be solved. The detectives who worked her case found redemption in the resolution they helped bring about. The family found closure, knowing that the man who took their daughter, their sister, their niece, would spend the rest of his days paying for his crime. The community found healing, reclaiming the park where tragedy had struck and filling it once again with the sounds of children at play. Genetic genealogy has since solved hundreds of cold cases across the country, giving hope to families who had long since given up. The techniques pioneered in cases like Michella's have become standard tools in the fight against crime, ensuring that the passage of time no longer provides protection for those who commit evil acts. And somewhere, in whatever realm of existence awaits those who have passed from this world, I like to think that Michella Welch found peace. Peace in knowing that she was never forgotten. Peace in knowing that justice, patient and persistent, eventually prevailed. Peace in knowing that her story would be told for generations to come, inspiring others to fight for those who can no longer fight for themselves. This is the power of never giving up. This is the power of technology in service of justice. This is the power of love that refuses to accept defeat, even in the face of unspeakable tragedy. If you have watched this entire story, you understand why cases like Michella's matter. You understand why we must never stop fighting for victims and their families, no matter how much time has passed. You understand why every child deserves to be remembered, protected, and, when necessary, avenged. Subscribe to this channel if you believe in justice. Share this video with everyone you know if you believe that stories like Michella's deserve to be told. And leave a comment below, telling me about a case that has touched your heart, a victim whose story you believe needs to be heard. Because when we share these stories, when we refuse to let victims be forgotten, we become part of the army of justice that eventually catches every monster, no matter how long they hide. Michella Welch was 12 years old. She loved animals. She took care of her sisters. She deserved to grow up. She didn't get that chance. But she got justice. And in the end, justice always wins.